Start a new recording there. Hello, YouTube. I know you guys have been pretty uh, energetic about my previous Stop Killing Games videos. Hopefully this one will put some things to rest, because I will be reacting directly to Ross and moving things forward with me and Ross talking on stream. That should happen soon-ish. I'm not going to give a time frame because I just told them what I have available and which time zone I'm in, and then I told them I'm going to react to this video first to see if it changes my outlook on some of the things and where we can go from there. So I'm still waiting to hear back on when he is available, and then we'll try to set up a time and we can have a call on stream. But before that, I want to react to this. I want to see what he has to say in 39 answers questioned, and it looks like he has broken them up into timestamps, which is really cool. So let's jump in and see what he has to say. And regardless of how he answers this, honestly, I'm just going to give this video a like already, because more discussion, more information, this is great.
Hi, this is a video on the Stop Killing Games campaign I've been doing.
Yeah.
Specifically the European Citizens Initiative. Now, since that's kicked off, I've seen lots of questions and concerns pop up. That's probably my fault. Honestly, there's hundreds of elements involved with this campaign, so it becomes a haze in my mind what I need to include in each video.
Yeah.
So instead, this video is the whole enchilada.
Okay.
I'm going to try to answer every big question I've seen. I don't want anyone to be against this campaign because they feel like they don't have enough information.
I agree.
Now, if you're already on board with this initiative, or if you're completely against it, then you probably don't need to watch this. In fact, I don't recommend it. It's probably going to be long and boring. This is more for people who
It's okay. This reaction will be longer and more boring.
really want to drill into the details.
Yeah.
Now, if you're watching this, I'm assuming you've watched one of these videos already. But if not, super quick recap, we've launched a European Citizens Initiative that, if passed, would allow customers to retain working copies of games they've paid for. Mostly full stop. It's more complicated than that, but that's what this and those videos are for. Oh, and one point that maybe didn't stick the first time, we're the only game in town on this. So if the practice of destroying video games bothers you and you're an EU citizen, this is your only chance to do something about it. If you're waiting for something better to come along, you'll die of old age before that happens.
It's probably true. Well, and you know, the good part about it is that this would affect the entire world, right? So don't FOMO. I mean, the good thing is that this, you know, will take place in EU, right? And will have to be, let's just say theoretically it gets incorporated as EU law in some form, because the EU is so large for pretty much every video game that exists, except for maybe some Asian games or games that are targeted only for specific audiences and don't have worldwide releases. Pretty much every game will have to go along with this, because skipping out on a large continent would be suicide for your game. So, you know, if it passes in EU, the whole world is generally going to have to get on board. This isn't the only one that can be raised. That's true, yeah. That's probably true. I don't know enough about the specifics of that to say yes or no, but I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe you don't believe me on that. Fine. But if this fails in 10 years, 20 years, you realize, I guess Stop Killing Games really was the last stand on that, huh? Okay, I'm going to get to the question.
I mean, is it true that if let's just say it fails, theoretically, can it not ever be raised to the EU Council, Parliament, or whatever the hell you call it over here again? Or can it just be raised again with new signatures? He said something funny about his looks as a comment. Let's not comment on people's appearance, especially somebody trying to do something ethical. I don't see why not. I don't know enough about it, so I don't know if you can like raise it, and if it doesn't pass, then that thing is just that has been settled. So I don't really know.
But before I do, there's a few core concepts that are going to come up again and again and might help frame all of this.
Okay.
Concept number 1, always ask, what's the alternative? I don't know if I've communicated this well, but I'm actually in favor of any solution that solves the problem of video games being destroyed.
Same. Same.
So when I hear criticisms of our plan, my first thought is always, what's the alternative solution that saves video games? If somebody has an alternate solution, cool, we're on the same team. Then we're just discussing tactics.
Yeah, it's like we have the same goal here, and I have the same goal as him. I don't know if the initiative that I've heard so far has proven to me that it's the right method to solve the problem. But I mean, that's what there's 39 questions that'll be answered here, so I'm hoping that some of my I have a lot of concerns with it. You know, if you want, you can watch previous videos about that on our channel. But I have concerns, and I'm hoping that there are some that are answered here. But you know, I don't know. You don't need to have an alternative to have the right to criticize a plan. No, but I do think that he's just generally saying that this is a discussion, right? That this is his idea. Let's talk about it and find an alternative to reformulate.
But if somebody does not have an alternate solution, but they're against our solution, well, then they're against all solutions. So deductively, that means they are in favor of perpetuating the destruction of games, which means they're the opposition. In which case, we don't really value their critique because they
I don't
don't
agree.
want to solve the problem. Like if a parent says to a kid,
I don't agree that if they're against the initiative, that they're against the goal. I think that can be burning bridges where it's important to have a conversation. I would reframe this as saying we have a goal to handle this, and while the initiative in its current wording may not be the perfect thing to do it, let's just open up that pathway, right? Because you have a lot of time between now and when those signatures are reached. I'd rather this be a more positive attempt to bring more people in. You should be bringing in all the critics, honestly, and saying, okay, why are you critical? How can we, assuage those concerns? How can we identify them and see if there are any outliers or examples that are going to cause problems down the line, either for developers or players, or developers and players. And this feels a bit too, what's the word? Exclusionary, I would say.
clean your room, I don't care how you do it. And the kid says no. Well, then the parent might clean the room for the kid and throw out some stuff they didn't want them to because the kid refused to solve the problem. So anything about our
Could just be
plans
the
you don't
wording.
like, I encourage everyone to ask, what's the alternative? It's a fast way to figure out who's on what side.
He could just be miswording it too. He could mean that he wants to have the discussion, but people who are just blindly against it without even trying to talk about it or offer an alternative may not be able to be persuaded. I think that's what he might be saying. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that entirely, but I think that's what he's saying. Talks about sides. We are all on the side of gaming. Yeah. Makes it a them versus us in the initiative itself. It kind of feels that way. Yeah.
And some people may not even realize that's their stance until they go through that process. I mean, they might have good intentions, but good intentions and no action, what does that get you? All right, just a couple more. Concept 2, most of what we're doing is about future games. For existing games, don't worry, we'll get to that. But the point is, this campaign is focused on games that don't even exist yet. So when I see comments saying what we're asking for is impossible or we don't know what we're talking about, what I hear is somebody saying it is impossible or impractical to make an online game in the future with an end-of-life plan.
Impossible and impractical are two different things. I don't think it's impossible. I do think that there are some impracticalities to the wording of the FAQ on the website that hopefully this will address in some way.
Now, I and many developers I've talked to think that's a pretty silly statement, but I've seen so many comments along those lines. I think a few out there have an almost myopic focus on games right now and how things can't change, and that's not where our focus is. Third concept, almost done. It is impossible to save games without some effort from developers and some disruption to the industry. The video game industry has been going down the wrong road on game preservation for a long time. There's so much damage already. Some out there think that the second there's any inconvenience to the industry, no matter how small, then this entire plan is unfeasible. It kind of reminds me of car manufacturers in the 60s when they
Yeah,
were
that's silly.
required to add seatbelts to cars. Car companies protested that up and down and fought it every step of the way. And you know what? Adding seatbelts did add to the cost and work of making a car. But how much, especially now that time has passed? I would guess less than 1%. I think it could be similar for video games of the future. Remember concept 2. And the last core concept, the European Citizens Initiative is not final law. Something
Yeah,
about it will
obviously.
change. It's inevitable. What we're trying to do is aim the arrow the best we can and hope it hits the mark. Okay, questions. Will the law we're proposing
Right, comparing a safety feature, the scale of equivalency is a bit different, and the impact, of course, but the concept is the same. So when you're comparing two things, you have to look at two separate aspects, which is number one, the scale, right? So saying that somebody thieving is just, it's the same concept as somebody killing someone else. Well, they're both crimes, but not all crimes have the same scale or weight to them. Obviously, putting in seatbelts in a car it's the same concept of adding in a disruption to the industry in order to have a better end goal, but they're two different scales. And what he's trying to say is that it's the same thing, that it's going to cause that disruption. So he's not comparing the scales or the actions here, but rather the idea of causing disruption for a better end result.
be retroactive? No, it couldn't be even if we wanted it to.
Yeah, it can be.
Sorry if that wasn't clear earlier. Isn't your initiative too vague? There's a few layers to this question. Like, remember concept 4. And it's not actually supposed to be final law. Like, did you know there's a word limit to it?
I didn't.
It's supposed to be a basic explanation and your reasons for it, and you have to cite which EU directives apply to show that the EU has authority for it. Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun doing that part. Also, have you looked at any of the other initiatives?
Nope.
This one, tax the rich. This initiative does not give a number as to what qualifies as rich. Or this one, creation of an environmental authority. That's talking about creating a new agency. Do you have any idea how many rules and regulations that would take? That would.
That's more of a reason of why it's vague, but does it have to be, right? Or could we actually put in some information there on the official Stop Killing Games website to address some of these concerns more thoroughly, as opposed to this initiative? This might have the word limit, right? I don't know if he's meaning this. If this has the word limit, fine. Let's put more of that info up on the official Stop Killing Games website. And that way, at least we have one source of it that isn't vague. So I do think that the original is vague. I don't think it should be or needs to be, even if this has a word limit, and this will be a bit vague compared to a more thorough source of information. So
Be books worth. So we could be more specific, but it wouldn't matter. That's not our job. That's the EU Commission's job. In some ways, this slide I posted is more important than the initiative itself, because this roughly reflects the views of the organizers, the people
of the organizers, sure, but I mean, this is still an exact reason why I think more developers need to speak up, and why, if you're receiving criticism from developers, why that matters, right? I don't think you can accurately gauge whether or not gamers want this. It's like saying, well, guess what? Every citizen in the world is going to get $1,000 for free every month. Well, of course, nobody's going to have a problem with that. But the people who do have a problem with it probably have some good reasons to bring up. So if you're receiving criticism from primarily game devs, there might be some reasons for that you, not being a game dev, don't know. And I think that those are important to look. So I don't know if I really care that defending or arguing that the initiative should be vague or has to be vague, or is okay of being vague. I don't really care. I do think it is too vague. Simple as that. Like, I don't think anything's going to persuade me that it isn't, because it is not written from the perspective of a game developer, of who those would be the most important voices to listen to in this, of people who know the complexities of making games and how it's going to impact the bottom line. I still want the grand result of this, which is that games are preserved, players can play them. I have my concerns of whether or not it's even worth it, because by the time a game dies, not enough people want to play it for it to really have been worth the development cost. But either way, if players want this, sure, we can talk about how we can achieve that in some realistic fashion, but it needs to be specific. I need to know how it's specific so that I can prepare for that and other developers can prepare for that. And if we don't know the wording of this, we don't know what to do. It might fuck us over in pretty expensive and large ways. So we want to talk about it, because before it comes into law, we want to have that backlog, that encyclopedia of already made content for lawmakers to look at and to gather feedback from. So that's why I think it's worth criticizing it the moment it gets put out here. It's because it's important to have that information be accurate.
Who will be going to Brussels to discuss this with the EU? Another layer to this is the law itself can be vague or broad.
It shouldn't be.
Police officers, they have to have reasonable suspicion to stop someone, and they need probable cause to arrest someone. What does that mean?
The difference with that being vague is that is on the shoulders of the state, right, to determine. So the reason reasonable suspicion is vague is because it needs to be, because every situation is different. The problem is that now when you've put a law in place that's vague for the people developing games, if they need to defend it in court, it is them paying money. And I promise you, if a developer needs to have lawyers on standby to argue their case of why they could or couldn't do something in regards to this initiative, that again is going to increase the cost of games. Whereas with police, it's on the state, so unfortunately that increases your taxes, is because they have to argue in court of why these things are reasonable suspicion. I understand the point trying to be made that it can be vague, but the reason that reasonable suspicion is vague as a law for police is because you can't really prove what's suspicious, but you can easily prove if a game is playable or not.
Yeah, see, you have to use some common sense, because the law can't cover every last scenario. Like, say an officer sees somebody who he thinks has weed on him, but it turns out it's just a bag of oregano. Do we need to write a law saying that if you're holding a bag of oregano, then that counts as reasonable suspicion? Well, what if we forgot to write a law for a bag of dried parsley? See, it just doesn't work. And it's the same for games. Like in the initial...
Sure, but you can still have accurate wording with the goals here of what do you constitute as a multiplayer game. You know, are there certain sizes of MMOs that are exempt? Because I certainly don't think the average consumer is going to be able to host a server for Star Citizen, right? I can't imagine what their servers look like, and I don't think the average player is going to be able to host that. I just, you know, we at least have some idea in place, and if you need help on that, I think that's where consulting with developers is really the direction to go.
Some were asking what is meant by a reasonably functional or playable state. Well, if it's a racing game, I would think that means you race cars in the game world. If it's an arena shooter, I would think that means you enter game maps and shoot at other players. If it's an RPG, boy, that could mean fight monsters, talk to NPCs, use items, manage your inventory, lots of stuff. But what if we try to be specific and make the law race cars in the game world? Well, does that work for the arena shooter or the RPG? I mean, I guess a few of them, but not most. It just won't work.
Well, that's also kind of an argument of why this initiative may not be possible. Is because, again, if developers need to have lawyers on standby for when the game dies, so that they can argue in court that not having this one feature, that this online feature, it was possible to put into the final build of the game when some random neckbeard sues them for not having it, that's going to increase the development costs. Simple as that. So, yeah, it kind of needs to be specific in some ways because otherwise it's going to open up that developer to lawsuits. And again, like it with police, the reason that reasonable suspicion is okay for police is because there are too many caveats, but that the state has the burden in that case. They have to prove reasonable suspicion was acted upon. But for developers, now that cost goes on to developers, not the government. And so developers will again have to have lawyers on retainer to prove that, or there needs to be some specific wording in the law that they can follow of what that means to be in a playable state. So I'm not saying that this initiative that you, Ross, need to have answered this, but that this will need to be answered on a legislative level by actual legislators, not me and you, right? Or not, people in chat unless they're lawyers. Somebody's going to have to solve this, and it's going to have to be done in a way that prevents either easy loopholes that essentially make this law or this legislation absolutely, pointless and moot, or I don't even know what to say. But in order to prevent these lawsuits from being taken against developers or publishers over frivolous things that could have been covered by the initial legislation. I think that made kind of sense.
Same goes for technology. What works code-wise for an arena shooter probably doesn't work for an MMO. That's why we leave it to the developer. Some were complaining about that. Well, the alternative would be to mandate exactly how every company writes the code that fixes their game. Not only is that unrealistic, nobody wants that. Specific rules do not work for all games.
That's correct. But if the wording is too vague, it will be easy to find loopholes. Because if you leave it up to the developer to define what is playable for their multiplayer game at end of life, I promise you they will define whatever they have available as playable.
But
they will specifically make the game unplayable before end of life. They will remove features, and then they will say, okay, well, now that the game is finished, well, we didn't have those features because of a new patch. We removed those features. We thought that was better for the health of the game. And now we've released the server binaries of what that last patch was providing. I mean, it's very, very easy to find loopholes to this that are not going to be good for players, and I don't want that.
Have to be broad. Doesn't your initiative
simpler solution before end of life? They will scale down to no longer being yes, exactly that, Lazy Fangs. Like, legitimately, that is an actual loophole that you would have. Just 1 week beforehand, just remove all the live service stuff, make it a barely functional husk of a game. Maybe they just remove the servers entirely, and then they will release, okay, it's playable. Done, bye-bye, next game.
Still go too far. Okay, we just covered why we have to be broad and can't be too specific, but there is a 0% chance this initiative survives with everything we're asking for. There's going to be industry input. In fact, I'm kind of worried about one of them. One of our members found out about a lobbying group, videogameseurope.eu. If you look at the membership list, there are a lot of companies with live service games.
What does this do, though? What is this?
.eu. If you look, one of our members found out about
Video Games Europe welcomes EU Council's conclusions on Europe's video game sector. Our membership covers the major video game publishers, many of which also have studios. Some of them have important esports activities and national trade associations in 15 countries in Europe. Look, there they are, Embracer Group, Activision Blizzard. Oh, the saviors of the industry.
A lot of companies with live service games on here.
Well, what are they trying to do?
I would feel so much better if CD Projekt was on this list. You know,
would you? The company that released Cyberpunk 2077 in a unplayable state at launch for consoles that was so bad it had to be removed from Sony's store for many months until they could make it actually reasonably playable, all because the shareholders pressured them to. That's who we'd feel better having on this list.
Major European game developer that gives a damn about preservation. Back to the initiative, it's going
Fair,
to
they
change.
do own GOG.
So we need to aim a little higher to hit the mark so we have
Fair.
some negotiating leverage. Okay, I am not speaking for the initiative members in this next part. It's not a hive mind. Some agree with me, some are more radical than me. But here are some compromises I personally might agree to.
Okay.
Instead of insisting that the game works on shutdown, have a best effort from the developers so that savvy users could repair the game. This could be server binaries, server source code, though again, this is optional, guys. That would not be the only option. I'm not mandating that. Or if we want to be really generous, repair instructions. Here, I'll pull up my old slide from a while back. This would kind of be the bare minimum.
Okay, absolute minimum effort necessary for games as a service developers to give customers a chance to run games after shutdown. Option 1, give notice of server shutdown. Release packet documentation, compile and release client software without encryption, DRM, anti-cheat modules, and distributed server software. Okay, option 2, give notice of server shutdown. Same, release packet documentation. Identify the type of encryption used for client and provide private key for game. Encryption is not a plugin. Customers are apparently advocating reverse engineering games. There are still some legal issues to this, but I think, I hate to say it, developers and publishers will just choose the easiest solution here. Which is the one that costs the least amount of money and requires the least amount of work? So if they don't have to release the game in a fully playable state, they're not going to. Which is proprietary or third party? Yes, there are still legal issues where there are proprietary or third party things that they don't want to release. But maybe he answers that here. We'll see.
Okay, back to compromises. Not include subscription service games. I'll get into that one later.
Okay.
And finally, grandfather in existing games. That would be a huge compromise because every game that's grandfathered in will die, or 98% of them, something around there. A higher percentage of those games would survive if they were not grandfathered in. So that's giving up hundreds of games right there. It would be a devil's bargain. Hundreds of games sacrificed to save almost all games in the future.
What does he mean by that? What is he? Which games does he mean, and what does he mean in this specific case by grandfather? Like, I know the general idea of grandfathering, but I thought he said he didn't want to include past games in this initiative. So is he saying that like existing games, so like let's say old school RuneScape, WoW, Final Fantasy, that they wouldn't be included in the initiative if theoretically the initiative got passed? I'm struggling to figure out if he means that they're included or not included in this compromise.
And this is about as far as the compromises could go. If we bargain below this, there's basically no point to any of this.
I already think that this compromise, while necessary, would kill the initiative.
Because then there would be so little protection, no games would be saved. So we have to have some buffer. Under your initiative, do all features need to work when the game is shut down? This is another point a few members disagree on. Me, I'd say no, but it's kind of a spectrum. We have that phrase, reasonably playable state. So let's say you have an online arena shooter, it shuts down, the company releases an end-of-life patch, and everything works except for achievements and matchmaking. Well, I think most people would say, yeah, good enough. The game's saved, it works. But then let's say you had another game, it shuts down, and you can technically start it, but all you can do is get into the main menu and nothing works past that. Well, in that other game, I think most people would not consider that a reasonably playable state. So that game might face a higher chance of receiving complaints to the Consumer Protection Agency in that country. So I can't tell you exactly where the dividing line is, but the more the game works, the more it's likely to be an acceptable solution.
I just wonder, like, okay, a company goes, maybe he answers this, a company goes bankrupt. They have to release what they have. It's not even playable, but like, you can't fix that. You can make complaints, but like the company's bankrupt. The same people working on it have moved to a different studio. They may not even know how to fix it. A lot of game dev companies, I hate to say it, but they work really inefficiently. They have like one person who knows how the fucking code works. And if that person leaves, the game can be in a horrible state. So it's like, what happens in this case? It's pointless if like 5 people play it at end of life. This law should not apply to every single game. Yeah, I agree. I think that at a point where game dies and the servers are taken offline, it's usually because there aren't enough people to generate enough income to sustain the server. So why would they spend so much time getting all that out to the players when only like 2 players want it? I mean, that's a bit of a extreme example, right? But even if there's only a couple hundred, it's just I don't know. Radical Entertainment Activision Prototype 1 and 2. What's the example there, Anomalies? I think that there were a lot of games that I wouldn't mind playing again, like Mag on the PS3 is one that I mentioned. 256 player, 128 versus 128 on the PS3 first person shooter. I'd love to try that again after the official servers were taken offline. The problem is, would I really play it for more than like a weekend? It's like I have a passing interest in trying it again, but it's only enough to play it for a week or 2 at most, and then I'm on to another game. And I just don't know if that's worth it for a lot of games. I don't know.
Do you expect companies to keep running servers forever? No, they can end support and turn off servers whenever they want. But they have to do it in a responsible way, like Gran Turismo Sport, Knockout City, Duelist, and so on. What about games that don't require a connection to the publisher or DRM servers, etc., when support ends to work? Nothing. Those kinds of games will be exempt from all of this. And that actually is most video games. Are any people
Let me hold on.
all of this? Support ends to
What
work.
happens to games that do not require a connection to the publisher DRM server? That seems like a weird question. Like, what? You know what it might be is that multiplayer games that you can just connect like peer to peer. That's what I'm wondering. Is if after official support, like after the last patch is put out, I think that's what it means is that it's like multiplayer games that you just connect peer to peer, and the client itself handles authentication and all that stuff. Although I will say that a lot of peer-to-peer games, especially on Steam, still connect to Steam. Yes, what about the games that aren't impacted by it? Yeah, it's kind of what I was feeling too. Activision published it, the devs got tired and got shut down. Activision sells it still. I think it would be Activision's responsibility. I mean, because those games are owned by Activision, right? So if I get Blizzard to publish Golden Chronicles, they wouldn't. I would certainly not accept that deal, but they would be the owners of the game technically. So essentially, in a lot of cases, the responsibility is pushed to publishers and not developers. But they don't know how to do it. I agree. Yeah. So it's like, what do you do in that case? That's what I'm thinking too. Is that if you didn't write the code and the code is not very well maintained, it's like spaghetti code. It is just financially terrible and oftentimes irresponsible to throw developers at it and say, "Can you get this working anymore?" Yeah, that's a good example.
Nothing. Those kinds of games will be exempt from all of this.
Okay.
And that actually is most video games. Are any people involved with this initiative developers? Yes, a few are game or server software developers in the initiative. I've also had a lot of game developers reach out to me in support of this, mostly indie ones. I think our highest profile game developer in support of this might be Running with Scissors, the developer of the Postal games.
Hi there, would you like to sign my petition?
I imagine they understand the madness we're facing better than most. And finally, there's been a couple developers at large companies that wish to remain anonymous, so they will. I'm a developer with an online-only game. What will happen if this initiative passes? Okay, first off, I can't answer this question 100%.
This is not the Postal
Back to
dude.
point 4, things will change. So a lot of this depends on what the EU decides. We'll start with existing games. You may have several options, though most of them are not ideal. But remember point 1 and point 3. Option 1, you can come up with an end-of-life plan to keep it working after shutdown. Though that may not be possible. See, you could have licenses and middleware that you don't have permission to distribute.
Yes.
Or you know what? Maybe you just don't want to work on the game anymore. I get it. Option 2, you could shut down the game before the law went into effect. Yes, that sucks, but you think it doesn't suck for the consumer every time every other game gets shut down? And the quick-to-react people out there might say, oh look, this proposal is going to kill games. You mean games that were on death row and were going to get killed anyway? So yes, this would move the timetable up, but the aftermath would be everything gets saved. Option 3, maybe. This one depends on the EU. You can move to a subscription model instead. Now this is probably a losing proposition in the long term, we know, but then at least customers are informed how much time they have left at any given time.
The thing is, like, how much would a subscription model have to make to host some of these servers? How many of the interested players that would want to play the game still, a lot of these games, like you said, are on death row. How many of them would be willing to now go from free to paying like $10, $15 a month just to keep playing the game that they were playing before? I don't know. If it were me, I'd be like, yeah, I'm going to go play a different game. Thanks, but no thanks. Only game I was disappointed with closing was WildStar. I miss WildStar. I do miss WildStar. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of these options. I'm not a fan. You mean hold on. I'm a developer with an online-only game. What will happen if this initiative passes?
Is a middleware that you don't have permission to distribute? Or you know what? Maybe you just don't want to work on the game anymore.
But the middleware and the third-party stuff, I mean, that matters. That's not simple. Like, that needs to be solved. How long is the video? 42 minutes. I don't know if he'll address that again, but that is a actual issue here. How many views? It just was 1 day ago, so it already has 60,000 views.
Source code, again, not mandatory. Release
Wait, what was
customer repair.
Take best effort actions to give the customer a reasonable chance to repair upon shutdown. Define reasonable.
Or run the game.
Because I could just release the executable and you can reverse engineer the code from that.
Game after shutdown. So this could be server binaries, maybe server source code, again, not mandatory. Releasing packet documentation, I'll bring up that slide again. Removing DRM and...
Okay, but I mean, let's just be realistic. Like, releasing binaries is way, way, way harder to reasonably repair than server source code.
And so on.
It's a way different
Something to give users a fighting chance. And option 5, another maybe.
And the thing is, when a game, I know I paused a lot, but when a game has like only 200 people still interested in playing it, how many of those people actually have the technical knowledge to repair that game? You would have most of the games that would fall under this initiative would just be discarded because nobody cares enough to repair it. So you still end up back at square one where this game is not playable and nobody gives a shit enough to make it playable. I just don't really see this happening. So it'd mostly work only if it has a really prolific modding scene, yes. Or if it was reasonably easy to repair, right? So it's just like it's adding extra cost that I would argue, and this is just purely speculative, in most cases, players aren't going to do. I really doubt the 200 people still playing the crew care enough about the game and know enough about reverse engineering and repairing server code for a game that they didn't code themselves to repair it enough to play it. You're just gonna have a bunch of people saying, hey, can somebody fix this game, please? Please, Reddit, somebody fix this game. And nobody's gonna do it. In which case, you haven't preserved anything. There's just more source code being dumped in the internet that nobody's gonna do anything with.
All games get grandfathered in, and none of this applies to existing games. This would kill the most games, but this is probably the option most developers would want. Now that's for existing games. For future games, It's everything I just mentioned, which have multiple maybes, except for grandfathering and shutting down before the law is active, obviously. I realize this is less than ideal, but remember point 3. We have to break the loop of games being designed with no end-of-life plan. Otherwise, this excuse gets perpetuated forever and progress becomes impossible.
That is true. You have to target it at its source if you want to do it. And that is the most important thing to me, is how much is doing this from the start going to cost new developers and new publishers. And in addition to that, is it feasible for every online game? Even I don't know the full scale of what EVE Online servers look like, or Star Citizen, massively multiplayer online games like those that may be running off of multiple shards and instances that could be pretty difficult to scale down. I just don't know. I do not know. Again, board of directors don't want to hear about end of life for live service. No, they don't. How can you even decide how long a game will live? I don't know the answer to that either.
Now, one thing I think some developers aren't considering is if this passes and it becomes a known requirement, I think there's going to be a gold rush for middleware developers to come up with easy solutions to create an end-of-life build for your game. The market forces would be enormous. I'm trying to...
That's just more cost, though. Like, yeah, I mean, there will be companies that pop up that can help you do that, but that's just more cost for development. I mean, and how do you even qualify this? Like, couldn't I just let's say, keeping a shard of a server open for 200 people to jump into costs me $1,000 a month, let's say. Well, what about just if I allow one person in? How much is that? Maybe $20 a month? Well, sure, only one person can play it, but the official servers aren't dead. End of life hasn't been reached. There'll be less games. There will be less games. XRB ratings also butchered the gaming scene. Yeah, the ratings are kind of weird for games.
To keep it real, this is not an ideal situation, and we actually want this to be as easy as possible on developers. But remember point 1, what's the alternative that still saves games? I don't know how this works without some compromise from the developers.
Agree.
If the initiative passes, what would developers have to change for future games while the game was being supported? Well, visibly, absolutely nothing, though you really should have an end-of-life plan. Other than that, it's business as usual. You can still have microtransactions, loot boxes, DLC, whatever. Would this
I mean, what's more unethical at this point? Lack of end-of-life support or loot boxes? Predatory microtransactions. Which one of these is negatively affecting more gamers? I would argue predatory microtransactions and loot boxes. I'm not saying the initiative's bad, but if we're going to target anything, I don't know.
Initiative affect subscription games? Well, that's another question that depends on what the EU says. Personally, I think it's very unlikely because that doesn't fit well with other existing consumer laws. I think the only way you could even make that argument would be that this is necessary for preservation. And most
I mean, if it doesn't affect subscription games, then I would just have a 1 cent subscription to my game if I was making a multiplayer game like that. And now I'm exempt from the law, right? So it's just another loophole. And I don't know how to close that, but it's like loopholes will be found by people that are much smarter and much less ethical than me.
Governments don't seem to care about that at all. However, I don't think this is a huge loss, since only a handful of games operate that way today. So if we can give up those, but then save 99% of other games, I'm willing to make that bargain. Won't lots of games turn subscription only if this passes? Well, first, I think that's very doubtful, but if this were to happen, I'm not sure you could even blame this on us. The thing is, we've been here before. In the 2000s, lots of publishers were trying to cash in on the success of EverQuest and especially World of Warcraft. There were MMOs popping up left and right with subscription fees, dozens of them. Almost all of those either died out or went free to play. It turns out a lot of people don't like having to pay money every single month for several games. The market's only so big.
That's not the reason that they necessarily died. It's because they're essentially infinity games. You play them for a long time, so people generally choose one MMO, two at most, to play at any given point in time. And so they just stuck around with the older games. They grouped up and clumped up into like 2 or 3 specific games. In this case, right now it's WoW, RuneScape, and Final Fantasy XIV. And you could argue like Elder Scrolls Online. And new games have to pull players away from that and then compete with a wealth of existing content. ESO, WoW, Final Fantasy, and RuneScape have years and years, in some cases, multiple decades of development already put into them that you have to compete with. And the cost of making MMO games is increasing because you have to compete with that, and because expectations of the market are so high, and marketing costs so much because you need to pull people away from those games. And that's just proven to be really difficult to do, and that difficult, it means costly in this case. So it's less risky to not make an MMO than it is to make an MMO. Amazon found that out with New World. How much did they spend on making New World? AGS has a budget of $500 million a year. New World, Amazon's $200 million blunder. $500 million. It's so much money. It's like, and what happened with it? How much is New World? How many people are playing New World these days? Wait, where is it? Fantasy Tavern Sextet. I'm not going to click on that. Where's New World? $3,000 people. And let me tell you, when you divide a certain number of millions by 3,000 people, the amount of money that that each individual player would have to spend to support the game's costs, it becomes pretty impossible. Even for whales.
Nowadays, it's mostly just the old guard that survived, like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy games, EVE Online. The market for subscription games is only so big, and publishers know this. Otherwise, they'd be cramming these subscription games down our mouth.
Yeah, but if now they have to make a subscription game in order to stay afloat, and they can avoid doing all this back-end bullshit in order to support the game end of life, they're just going to go with a subscription and just charge people like, I don't know, $1 a month or something. They'll still have microtransactions because that's where most of the money will be made from. But if they can charge a small amount of money to avoid having to do this, I promise you they will do it.
Speaking of which, this is already happening, or trying to. EA and Ubisoft have subscription services. PlayStation Now, Game Pass. Stadia died, thankfully, and it had exclusives. Well, what happens when these other subscription services decide, hey, we should have exclusives too that you have to rent to play? We're already on this trajectory, so there's not a lot to lose here. But I don't think we're going to lose much on these lines anyway. You're talking mostly about live service games. Isn't it unreasonable to expect to own a service? Oh boy, this is going to be a long answer. This one gets into the weeds. First, let's talk about the legal answer to this. In Europe, the United States, forget it. Subscription-based games, I don't think we have a leg to stand on in regard to commerce law. So that's World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and so on. These games tell you exactly when they end, and that's what normal services do.
Do they? I mean, wouldn't that solve... Wait, what? They don't tell you when they'll end. I don't understand that.
So yeah,
I don't know
I
enough
don't think
about
there's
that.
anything in the law that gets us there, and as I mentioned earlier, I also think it's a hard ask. But what about other live service games? Ones that you buy once, then that's it. So games like
I
The
don't know.
Crew, Destiny, Overwatch.
Okay.
It is not clear in multiple countries if those are goods or services. You pay a one-time fee for a product with
Okay, so it must be a legal... There is a legal distinction, and he cannot... This law would not apply to services. It would only apply to goods. And because you're purchasing a game and you're obtaining a good and not a service, the law would apply to... I'm starting to understand it. But because the subscription-based games are considered services, they fall under other law that necessitates that they say when their end of life will occur, and this initiative would not apply to services. So what I see big publishers doing is just finding a loophole to define their game as a service to not have to fall under this initiative. That's kind of what I see here, potentially.
no stated expiration date. That sounds like a good. But it depends on an external service, except you're not told how long that lasts. So that doesn't really meet the full definition of a service commercially either. Now, you can buy lifetime memberships to things, but those are associated with the business operating. So if I bought a lifetime membership to a gym, then it's canceled after 4 years, but the gym is still operating and trying to sell me a new lifetime plan, I'd be pissed. I think you could sue for that. The Culling 2, a one-time purchase, lasted 8 days before shutdown. Guild Wars, also a one-time purchase, has been going for over 19 years. So how can customers make an informed decision with that kind of spread? Consumer laws can get picky about that sort of thing. If I bought a warranty for a dryer and the company refused to tell me how long that warranty lasted, maybe it's a week, maybe it's 5 years. We're not going to tell you. How the hell would that be legal in other industries? So just because they call themselves service games doesn't mean they fit the legal definition of a service.
I mean, couldn't we argue then that having just a required amount of... Like we mentioned before in a previous video, wouldn't it be maybe better to have a minimum amount of time that the servers must be kept online, or that you have a minimum amount of time to declare that these servers will be taken offline, and anybody who purchased it within a, let's say, 3-month period of that announcement, so before that announcement, can request a full refund, no questions asked. I mean, that to me seems like a reasonable potential compromise that doesn't affect the industry too much, if we assume that there are too many caveats and loopholes that this initiative just wouldn't be possible. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but I'm just saying that worst case, there might still be a way that we can protect consumers. Protect consumers. I was trying to think of another word after that, but no, that works just fine without this initiative maybe passing in the current wording and desired.
So that's the legal side, but let's move into the philosophical side.
Okay.
I am not aware of any live service game that couldn't be converted to something you couldn't preserve forever if customers had access to the code.
Yeah, but you could say that with any game. If customers have access to the code, they can make the game whatever they want. So That's just any game. That's any piece of software. If you give, theoretically, philosophically, if you give customers the code for anything digital, they can do anything with it. Sure.
Okay, now this here is just my outlook, but with the service game, there's stuff I consider a real service and an artificial service. The real services
Okay.
take real people doing something. So that would be player moderation, creating new content,
Yeah.
bug fixes, technical support, and the cost and convenience of running company servers.
Yeah.
There's more. The point is, this all takes real people actively working. If they stop, so does the service. Now, the artificial service is being able to run the game. The only reason it's a service is because the code is being withheld. Unlike the other column, no human even needs to be alive for this part to work, because the work was already done. The second the customer has a copy of the server software, it ceases being a service. Yeah, I might need some custom hardware, but preservationists will jump through those hoops.
Not for most games. Not for most games. I've said it once, I'll say it again. The reason people are playing private WoW servers is because people are still interested in playing WoW. If WoW had no players on their official servers, for whatever reason, it's more likely than not, it's because people don't want to play the game anymore, and therefore they will not probably jump through hoops to save it. It's just like if it died a natural death, nobody's going to resurrect it with all this work required years later in order to play it for a weekend or something. It's unlikely to happen except for super big, super well-known games, because I promise you, for every game we can name that went offline that we wish we could play again, there's probably at least a dozen that we don't know about and don't care about, and nobody wants to play anymore because they've forgotten all about it.
And it's not like they're freeloaders. The customers have already paid the company money for the game.
For the game, not the server code. I want to make that distinction because there are different amounts of investment and proprietary knowledge here. And that if you're paying for raw code, you are paying for proprietary knowledge that the company has amassed. And if they choose to distribute that, I honestly think they have a right to charge for it. It's code. If an outsourcing company can charge for code, if a coder can do contract work and charge for the code that they make, I'm sorry to say, I think that there's a reasonable expectation that businesses have that they should be able to charge for that server software. I mean, and maybe we can make a compromise here. Pay $60 for the game, or pay $80 for the game and a copy of the code at end of life. And maybe that can help offset it. Or you can realize that not many people will choose that option because 99.9% of players, minimum, just want to play the game. They're going to pay $60, not $80. And the people who actually want the server will pay $80, and probably at the end of it, most of them just won't use it. They'll look at it and say, oh, that's pretty cool. Oh, that's how it worked behind the scenes? No, I don't really want to get a server running because that would be too much work, and I've already moved on to this new game. But, you know, if we want to go the route of philosophical compromises, I think that is a reasonable compromise.
Sometimes a crap load of money. And it's insult to injury that many games will just give you the server side as part of your purchase. So
Different games, different ways of working. Very different ways. And giving you a built version of the game is different. You know, giving you the binaries of the game is different than giving you the source code. There are two very different things here, because in one case, if you were given the binaries, you are protected as a company with your proprietary code. Sure, you can reverse engineer some of the code, but then you can sue people who have stolen that code because you own it. I would also see, okay, companies can license the code out. Again, license, maybe it's a free license, but they can still revoke it at any time. So if somebody is doing something that they don't want being done with their original server code, they can, you know, it's like, because at this point, who owns the code? You can still freely distribute code for server, for game servers, but it's still owned by the company that made it, in which case they still have the legal right to tell people, you can look at the code, you can run the code on your own computer, but you are not allowed to host private servers. So again, the initiative does need to talk about this. Maybe one of these future questions will, but that's still a concern. Releasing something for free does not mean that you have a license to do with it what you will. Just like when you download a font, when you download an image, when you use AI, even if you pay for an AI subscription thing, you are not legally required for like Midjourney unless you have the tier that allows for commercial use. So there is a distinction here between providing server code and licensing server code and being able to use server code in a commercial fashion.
So even on a conceptual level, we are really stretching definitions to call this part of the game a service. And let me tell you a secret. Any game can be made into a service game. Like take Super Mario Brothers. You can remove the Goombas and the power block locations, hold that data server side, and then lock you out in the menu until you authenticate. Now, Super Mario Brothers is a live service game that will...
Is that legally the definition of a live service game? I don't know what the legal definition is, but if that's all that makes it a live service game, that's a little bit weird to me.
Brick if the company shuts it down. Hooray! All this crap that prevents you from playing the game is artificial. Now, of course, it makes sense to keep running it as a service because you can make a lot of money that way. Plus, all those real services.
But you don't make money from authenticating players. I mean, that's just bullshit hurdles that players have to jump through. It's usually as a way to prevent piracy, right? Because you have to authenticate that copy of the game is legitimate. And a lot of games that you pirate have removed things like this, right? Even Payday 3 had its DRM removed. And it had a lot of DRM because I was able to play it. So... I don't know if that's really what constitutes a service, but authenticating to protect against piracy, which I think is kind of stupid in a lot of cases, it doesn't make you money. If anything, you lose money because players will rate your game poorly because it has that requirement.
Mention improve the quality of the game. And we're not trying to stop any of that. Companies can keep making money as long as they want to. We're specifically talking about cases where all the services have shut down and the company is no longer making money. Now, of course, there can be many legal reasons the company doesn't just release their server software to customers once they're done making money. But guess what? That's why we're trying to get the law changed, so these barriers don't need to exist. And this next part, I don't know if I can even explain to everyone, but art has innate value to me, which includes games. I think destroying good art is awful. Games are code. They can be preserved, but we're creating systems where destruction is the only option possible, and it's preventable. Every time MMO emulators get leaked or reverse engineered or released by the devs themselves, it just shows this is all possible. I would like to see all games people care about saved, even the subscription ones, even though I know I don't have a legal angle on those. But other live service games, give me a break. At this point in time, it's not even clear if those are breaking the law or not. But even if they're not, customers hate having their games destroyed. This is not a hard concept to understand.
I guarantee you that a lot of those leaked MMO servers are probably breaking some sort of law. Or infringing on somebody's copyright. Even if they aren't breaking a law, because there's criminal suits, there's civil suits. Infringing on somebody's copyright is a civil matter. Breaking the law, like I don't know if there was I can't name any laws that would probably be broken here. It would probably all be civil cases, right? If somebody's like, I don't know, third party, or if an individual developer licensed a code to the company to use it in that game, that license wouldn't extend to the people who download the servers. So that's another civil suit. It's a lot of like legal civil hurdles that need to be jumped through, and just like modding in some cases can be construed as potentially having legal consequences, which is the exact reason why Nintendo can send cease and desists to anyone for making a Pokemon fan game, even if you aren't planning to monetize it, it's because it's still the intellectual property of that company. And games that, even if the company goes under, a lot of times another company buys that intellectual property. Even if they're not making games of that anymore. Ultima, one of the greatest RPG series ever fucking made, is owned by EA. They don't make Ultima games anymore. But I'll tell you what, if you try to make an Ultima game and you try to commercialize it, guess what's going to arrive in your mailbox? Cease and desist from EA. So, just stating that it has happened before does not mean that it is legally okay to continue happening. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm against it or whatever. I don't mind it. I don't really care. If people pirate my game, I don't give a shit. I just hope that they enjoy the game. But let's not kid ourselves that piracy is illegal, right? And it is illegal, and if people pirate my game, it is illegal. I'm not going to stop them. I don't really give a shit. But some people do give a shit, and some people will care, and they will send those cease and desists.
The mindset here is aspirational, to try and make art and gaming better than it is now, because there's so much obvious destruction. Why settle for an awful practice that might be illegal when a better way hasn't even been tried? If you don't get it, I don't think you will.
I can agree with
trying.
trying.
Gaming will get worse because of government involvement? I think there's a bigger chance it gets worse without government involvement. Now, could they misinterpret things or apply this in a clunky way? Sure, but we don't have much to lose. From our perspective, there's nothing worse in gaming than having games.
If they apply the law in a clunky way, I promise there will be loopholes. But inevitably, it will cost developers more. And if it costs more, that money has to be made. A return on investment needs to be had for these games. And if you increase the costs, you increase the need for return on investment. Simple as that. And guess who is investing in these games where that return needs to come from? It's from us. It's from the players. They're going to charge more for games. They're going to put more microtransactions in and charge more for them. If you're okay with that, fine. That will happen. If you're okay with it, that's what will happen. But if you're not okay with it, I think we need to be very, very careful and specific about making sure that the wording of these laws is very, very deliberate and thought out.
You like destroyed. This practice has already destroyed hundreds of games. We can see where this is going. What if in the future 90% of games are online only and they just keep killing them? They're coming for all your crap. The industry refuses to solve this problem. It wants more of it. Government's the only option left. You think I want to be doing this? Any of it? Government's the last resort. Why don't you just not buy games that require an online connection and vote with your wallet? Well, for starters, we prefer to vote with our votes. We think it's more democratic. But the main reason is this doesn't accomplish our goals. I mean, our goal is to save games we like. So if we buy the game, it gets destroyed. If we don't buy the game, it gets destroyed. So, I mean, why don't you...
Yeah, but the argument isn't that if there's a large enough pushback towards a publisher announcing a new game, they will change course. Absolutely they will. So yeah, if there's a large enough initiative to not buy games with millions of people, let's say you can get 1 million people on board, MMO players that say, okay, we are not going to buy our game, or we're going to cancel our subscriptions if you do not provide the server binaries or something. Well, guess what? I guarantee publishers will listen to that. Because at a certain point, the cost for making it outweighs the cost being lost. Or I'm sorry, in this case, the cost to not do it outweighs the cost to just make it. So I think you can vote for your wallet, and I don't think that that's undemocratic. In fact, I think that is the most freedom you have with your money is where you spend it. That's just what the free market is. You are perfectly capable of not spending your money at companies and on goods that you don't think provide you with the value. And if the value for a game, for an online game to you, is to be able to play it forever, theoretically, then If a game isn't providing that or isn't saying that it provides that, then don't buy that game. Organize, which you have the right to do, and I think that you are well within your right and capabilities to do so, to form a group of people, of fans of this game that won't buy the game unless the developers provide this. Now just know, yeah, that could end up with the game being killed. But guess what? If the cost of doing that is already too high for the game to not be made in the first place, then the game won't get the publishing. It's just they'll say, well, in order to make this game, we now need 20% more in terms of funding, and at that point, we don't think that the market for this is going to return the investment that we put into it. In which case, the game is dead too. So, in all cases of this, unless you allow things to continue the way they're going, it's going to make games cost more, and that is going to result in games getting killed. You just won't know that they're getting killed because they were never announced in the first place. And I promise you, games are getting killed all the time, and they're not being announced, because why would you announce a game before you know for sure if it's going to hit market? That's a pretty bad business practice.
Why don't you not listen to music you like? Or why don't you not watch movies you like? What exactly are we doing then? Of course, the real answer is, why aren't we boycotting games that do this? Well, that's easy. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not sure a boycott of a game has ever worked, ever. And if it has, then what I'm really sure of is no game that's enjoyable has ever had a successful boycott. Like, I think the one for Modern Warfare 2 is a meme at this point.
I don't know if I can prove or disprove that, but there have been small boycotts. I mean, the Stellar Blade is a recent example that I remember of people wanting the old costumes in. Now, this is certainly not to compare the scale of wanting a costume reverted and wanting the game to be playable indefinitely, but I mean, they do work. So if you're able to get, I don't know, 300,000 people to sign your initiative, why not get 300,000 people to target a multiplayer game that's coming out? I mean, these are all possible.
And boycotts have been tried. This is advocating for something with a 100% failure rate. I would bet money on that not working. What we're doing is trying something that has never been done before, so it might work. Won't this go nowhere because customers signed a EULA that says companies can do this? A few things. Straight from the EU itself. Directive 9313 EEC prohibits unfair terms causing a significant imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations to the detriment of consumers. Yeah, that's probably 95% of all game EULAs ever written. That's being investigated as you watch this. Plus, the initiative itself says it would supersede the EULA on this issue. What we're doing here is trying to take removal of your ownership off the table entirely. Would this initiative affect free games? Well, that depends. Is the game truly free, as in freeware? If yes, then no, it would be exempt. Do anything you want. But if it's free to play and has microtransactions sold as one-time purchases with no expiration date, then you're not entitled to the game, but you are entitled to those purchased microtransactions, which need the game to function. So, yes.
I mean, like we said before, I'll just remove all the microtransactions in the store 1 week before we take the servers offline, and now the game is free to play. You know, there are loopholes here. There are loopholes that will be abused. Not by me, but by people who don't give a fuck. And I'll tell you what, I've talked to a lot of people who wear suits to development conferences. They don't give a fuck. If it saves them $1, they'll do it.
Doesn't this initiative intrude upon developer rights and freedom? That is a valid argument to make, and we respect it 100% for free games. But once you start taking money to sell or lease something, you enter the world of commerce. And taking people's money means you're assuming more responsibility for your actions. Every nation has rules on this. So technically, yes, but that's to balance with buyer rights and freedoms.
This must be why it only applies to games as a service and not a good, because you buy a good as is, right? But games as a service you are providing that support for that over time. So there is a point to this where if the law is too overbearing, it would it would make it too risky to make a service-based game. And so developers would just stop making service-based games. In a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, especially I think smaller developers to where the budget is already paper thin and you're trying to, do with every dollar the best you can, you would just have fewer service games being made. Which, for better or worse, I guess, depending on your personality and your interests. Aren't all games service-based? Every game nowadays provides post-launch patches. But the patches are not expected upon purchase of the game because you're purchasing it as is, I believe. Do not take my word on anything I'm saying about this as factual, but I'm assuming that because you're buying it as is, you are accepting it with those flaws, and it's Steam that it has its refund policy in place as a ways to protect consumers, but technically I don't think they need to do that in all countries because you're buying it as is. Just when you go to the store, you buy an apple and you bite into it and it's got a worm. Unless there's something that states that you are not expected to find a worm in there, I guess you're buying it as is. I don't know. I really don't know.
A health inspector tells a restaurant it needs to follow certain procedures. Does that intrude upon a chef's rights and freedoms? Yes, but as a society, we generally think that's worth it. Now
I think, Lazy Things, I think you can force a game through the Steam command line to download old depots. I think. Because you have to do that to like downgrade Fallout 4, for instance, and I've had to do that for one other game, but I don't remember which one. You just can't do it directly through Steam's GUI. The service that is provided in which changes the product all the time. I don't know the specifics. I really don't know.
That's about safety. This is about preservation and consumer rights. Under your proposal, when a game shuts down, does that mean everyone gets the game for free? No. Only existing customers will be entitled to their copies. Now, that's less than ideal for preservation, but to have anything else would have to upend copyright law, and forget it.
But I mean, providing servers is still potentially causing issues with the copyright. For instance, there are games that do need to download things from the server itself, so the server hosts files, and you're downloading that from the server itself. Now, that's very few games, but it does exist, right? And it's to keep download small. Actually, a lot of free-to-play games do that. They download directly from the server itself. That way, your installer is fairly minimal in size, and you're downloading only what you need to use. Especially mobile games do that a lot. Early access kind of service as well. The game is literally made over time. I don't know the specifics. There is something to protect consumers when it comes to early access games on Steam. I don't know what it is, though.
Besides, you never know. Some companies just release old games for free anyway, but it would be their choice. What about people who are banned from online games?
You can't do anything about that.
Well, as long as the company's still supporting the game, they still stay banned. However, as a customer, they would be entitled to an end-of-life patch whenever that was. So it might be a year, it might be 15 years. Could be a pretty long ban. To have anything else would create a loophole for developers where they could just ban all customers at the end of life and skirt around the requirement that way.
It would do that.
Wouldn't this make cheating rampant in games?
I mean, it's private servers. Who the fuck cares? But yes, I mean, when you have somebody private owning and hosting a server, I promise you, you're going to get shitty moderation. You're going to get people cheating. You're going to get weird microtransactions, some kinds, in order to help maintain the server.
You know, I've seen this question before, and I'm always confused by it. So maybe I'm not getting something here. Nothing would go into effect until the game is shut down. So I don't know how that would change anything compared to now.
Nothing burger.
Online games are under assault by cheaters all the time, even without this initiative. Now, if you're talking about the potential to cheat in games post-shutdown, then yes, cheating could be very rampant. But why would that matter? Because the alternative would be a completely dead game. Usually what happens in these cases is small communities emerge and they kind of self-police to keep cheaters out. But yeah, I might be confused on this question. I still don't quite get it. What
Doesn't
if
matter.
players purposefully try to tank a game knowing they can get an end-of-life build if they do it? Well, again, only paying customers would be entitled to an end-of-life build, so they would still have to
That would
pay
be
for
hard to
that
do.
privilege. But I think most people who buy a game want to play that game, and the experience tends to be a lot better while it is actively supported, so there's an incentive to keep it going. But this is already a risk of online games. I just mentioned earlier, they're constantly under assault by people trying to force cheats or exploits or whatever. I guess if it gets really bad, you can sue. Bungie sued that cheat maker and they won. Plus, isn't there an entire anti-cheat industry focused on this? I think what might happen is you might see an increase of attempts of that at first due to the novelty of it, but then incentive will probably drop to where it is now already. What about console games? Are they covered?
Yeah, I was gonna ask this. That he mentioned Stadia before. It's like, what happens if a console just isn't supported? What if there is some authentication to some store that needs to be made in order to play these games, right? Because it's a digital purchase, right? In order to verify that the digital purchase is, I don't know. I'm just thinking that there might be some issues here with console games, especially because consoles are just a very different beast compared to PC. Very, very different.
This one gets tricky. The answer is yes, but it's another one that depends on what the EU says. It might not be possible to release the server on the console also, so what they would have to do is release the server software for another platform that you could host elsewhere, and then be able to point the console towards that separate server. But where it gets muddy is when you need to pay the console maker just to have that internet access in the first place. So there could still be liability, but it would be off the game publisher's shoulders at that point and onto the console makers. And it's not clear to me if the console maker would take liability when that game shuts down or when they discontinue the console. I think the latter would be more likely, so the console maker would just have to make it so the console's not bricked from the internet once they discontinue it. So you would get your game back, but it might take a while. What about mobile games? Would they be affected? I don't see why not, though the sheer quantity of them might lend more weight to the grandfathering argument.
there's a lot of trash mobile games, and they pretty much all need access to the internet because that's the way they monetize. The days of premium, actually decent mobile games is pretty much over. I mean, they still exist, but even it's like, if I know that a good mobile game exists, I still feel weird paying $5 to $10 for it because I don't know. Maybe I've just been burned by the, I play an Android, right? So I've been burned by the Android store for too long, and it's like, I'm not gonna risk it. I can already imagine Sony recalling their consoles to allow post-obsolescence usage of internet. Yeah, there's weird stuff here. I can't really answer the console or mobile thing yet because I haven't really thought about it, but there might be some issues. I do know that, like, The Crew, I still think is a bad example. Some people kind of were like going against me in that in the comments, and I agreed with some things, but I then reminded myself that almost all the cars in The Crew are licensed cars. And those licenses, I promise you, do not extend to allowing players to use those end of life. I'm not saying that can't change, but if you ever worked with licensors, licensors, I think licensors is the correct term, they are not very understanding of games. A lot of times they don't know what a game is or what it does. And a good example that I used was that train manufacturers in the game that I worked on did not even allow us to derail the train. And it wasn't visual. It was just a black screen that says you derailed, right? Because we couldn't, we didn't want to simulate the physics of the train derailing with passengers inside and everything. It kind of muddied the water with our ratings. So even when it was a player caused issue of speeding to speeds that aren't allowed, on the rails, we couldn't do it legally because the people giving us the license said, no, we don't want customers associating our trains with derailing, even though it's the player's fault. So, I don't know, there's issues with different, every game is different, every game has different problems with releasing it like this.
I think it would be a similar situation as consoles. It either gets hosted on the mobile device, or it's released for a separate platform that it can connect to.
I guarantee you, hosting an entire mobile game and client on your mobile device, it ain't happening. That's the reason that servers are made, is to pull all of that processing power off of your device and onto something else that can handle it. A server computer. Something with some really powerful CPUs, sometimes multiple CPUs, tons of RAM, and enough throughput that it can get all that data transferred with the bandwidth. That ain't gonna happen for a lot of games.
How long would companies have to host patches or end of life plans? I don't know, just long enough so users have a chance to grab it? 90 days? Could be less. Won't this mean companies stop making MMO or live service games in the EU?
Some companies will stop doing it worldwide, yes.
I think it's a complete bluff from any major company saying this. The population of the EU is 450 million people. It's a huge market. The industry stands to lose billions by doing something like that. And remember, this doesn't exclude microtransactions, DLC, even loot boxes. So companies could keep the money rolling in.
I know, but the issue that I have with this is you're saying we're going to stop something unethical, but because of doing that, companies, you can continue to do other things that, in my opinion, are unethical. Like, it's a trade-off that I just don't think is worth it, because most games that have gone offline, I don't want to play anymore because I stopped playing them. That's why my player count wasn't contributed to the final days of that game. So, I don't want to have more unethical shit shoved in my live service games just so that a few people might be able to reverse engineer it and host a private server that I won't play. Won't lose money if you pivot to other types of games? Yes, and that's what will happen. It's just like, nope, making a live service game now with this new law, it's too risky. Let's go make a single player game. And again, if that's what you wanted from this initiative, then so be it. Mobile market, oh yeah, maybe the mobile market. This will finally save the mobile games market. If it did, I would definitely approve of that.
Now compare that loss to the cost of an end-of-life plan from the design phase onward.
But you don't know how much that costs. You don't. And I promise you, depending on the game, that can cost a reasonable amount to a very high amount. And all of that, again, will have to be made back by the developers or publishers. Hey Slavical, good morning, afternoon, evening. Morning for me. I've heard about this from Thor. Apparently this guy wants to write a petition because of the racing game that's no longer being supported. That is the poster child for this initiative, yes. And it has some... I don't disagree with what it's trying to achieve. I just don't think that it can succeed in that. I don't know. I'm not a legislator. I'm just trying to voice my own opinion on this, and there are some issues that I see, some loopholes that will be abused, and I think that it's trading one unethical thing for another unethical thing. Like, well, if it costs more to make the game, and at the very least when it ends you'll be able to play it however long you want, but the trade-off is that now the companies have to do more monetization of that live service game, meaning more in some cases abusive monetization methods, but just more being thrown at you, more like a density of those monetization methods or higher cost of them. And in which case, higher cost doesn't always mean more money made, right? I can release my game Cauldron Chronicles at $60, and it may sell fewer copies than I would have gotten at $20. And if the number of copies at $20 is over 3 times what I would have sold at $60, I will make more money selling it at $20. So there isn't always a trade-off of, well, they can just charge more for it. No, they will need to sell more of them or just make more money from them, right? So what parts do you agree and disagree with? I haven't really been paying attention to what this movement is trying to do. Number one, I think that the biggest part of it is that it will just cost more for developers. And because of that, that's going to have to be passed on to consumers, either directly or indirectly, right? That if the game costs more to make, it has to make more money back in order to be made. And I don't always think that the way of the way the publishers and developers will do that is going to be the most ethical. And then I think that there are too many loopholes in this that could be abused and will be abused by big publishers like Ubisoft and EA, to where they can find a way out of having to do this, or a way out of having to do this very well, that will just end up in the same spot with a higher cost of development for smaller developers. There's a lot of little points to this. I can't go over it again, but there's legal issues with releasing source code, with releasing source assets, third party middleware being used for authentication, or for some sort licenses within the game that could prevent this from happening. Intellectual property rights still being owned by companies, so even though they're forced to do this, they could still just send cease and desists to people trying to host private servers. There are issues with this.
I still think it could be less than 1%. Companies tend to do what makes the most money. But
Yes.
fine, let's say they pulled out. You think other companies wouldn't rush in to take their market share? The rules would have changed a little bit, but the demand wouldn't have left. Even smaller companies, I think, is also unlikely, especially as middleware solutions for this would emerge. However, point 3,
Middleware costs money.
the in-between phase could be rocky. But to think that they're going to go away? Yes.
Is somebody trying to beat your door? Somebody's making a lot of fucking noise upstairs. Sorry that it's extending to you guys. They've kind of stopped now, but yeah. Kind of.
Yeah, I guess if companies suddenly stop liking money,
But the thing is, even if middleware solutions existed for this, that's still a lot of money. I understand the desire for doing this, but it's not that it's only going to be rocky at the start. It is going to increase costs because they have to create more that will be used after the end of life, right? Already near the end of life, if you know that only a couple thousand players are playing New World, I promise you, they have scaled down the servers and developers working on that. So they don't develop this after the game is done. They need to prepare for it the moment the game is designed. Like he's mentioned. I'm not trying to say he hasn't mentioned it, but that will require more developers from the start of development. And one of the largest costs for any game development is the people making the game. We already showed this with our budget breakdown. It's pretty much all salary. So if you have to pay 2 or 3 additional developers to make this over the course of, let's say, 3 years, or even, God forbid, 10 years plus, that's a lot of money going into it. Let's just say an average of $80,000 plus, let's bump it up to 100,000 for the sake of costs for having that employee. 100,000 for 3 people, 300,000 a year over the course of 3 years is near $1 million just to enable this end of life support. Times 10, now you're looking at 10 million. You're not seeing the easiest solution, use ChatGPT, right? So I'm just saying there is a cost to this. It's larger than you think. You can't just make this server available to players near the end of life, because in a lot of cases you need to design for that and have a way to easily remove things without fucking over the game. I got genius over here. Would it be security risk for companies to release their server software? Yes, sometimes.
Security risk for companies to release their server software? Mostly no, but there are some cases, yes, this is a valid argument. Particularly when a company shuts down a game, but they have a new game that runs on the same engine.
That's one of the arguments we
make. So
make.
if users find exploits on the old engine, they have them for the new one potentially. I swear I'm not trying to be dismissive, but I have to call on points 1 and 3 again. So the question is, are these outlier cases where this is a problem a good enough excuse to destroy all online-only games?
I won't say that it's a good enough excuse. What I will say is that you could argue that it's a good thing that people find vulnerabilities and then they can patch that in all of their live games. Just again, that will increase cost, and increased cost, we've been down this road. It will be passed on to customers. So if you're okay with that,
of course, I'm going to land on no. The cost is too high for everyone else. Is this only about single player games or multiplayer too?
Was it ever about
I'll
single
answer
player
that
games?
question with a question. What does Destiny 2, The Crew, Need for Speed 2015, and The Division all have in common?
They were mediocre. I don't know. They were pretty mediocre games. Is it a trick question?
Are they single player or multiplayer games? Yes.
Yeah,
So
they have
even if we
elements.
didn't care about multiplayer at all, which isn't the case, the industry has forced our hand. So in order to save single player in games like these, we have to save the multiplayer also because they've merged it all together.
Not with the Division. The Division, I can't speak for the other games because I didn't play them, but I did play a lot of the Division. You could remove the Dark Zone in the Division, and the game would not be negatively affected from it. I mean, the Dark Zone, I think, was actually the coolest aspect of the Division. If there was anything that I would want to save from that game, it would be the Dark Zone. It was really, really awesome and well designed. But you could remove it, and the single player elements would still be in the game and workable.
Otherwise, they would just get exempt on almost every game.
The
Plus, an
Dark Zone.
arena shooter with 8 players or 12? You can't have an end of life plan for that? Give me a break. Now, MMOs can be a tall order, but we've seen both legitimate and illegitimate emulators emerge to know this is possible. So it's both. The industry's given us no choice. Would developers be required to convert multiplayer games into single player games? Yeah, this one kind of confused me. I mean, nothing about the gameplay would have to change. It's all about running the game, period. Like, I'm thinking of a case like Star Siege Tribes, where that's a multiplayer focused game. There's no bots, campaign, or
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
But you can technically enter a level and run around by yourself.
But is that worth it? That's what I want to know, because that was the question I brought up with PlanetSide 2, right? Is at a certain point, is it worth it to be playable? Like, it's just being able to load up a game with no bots, run around and shoot nothing. Is it the same game anymore? Have you preserved the game, or have you preserved a skeletal husk of a game where the memories of nostalgia and high-level players fucking you over as a noob, those are the only things that remain that remind you of what the game actually is?
Fine, mission accomplished.
Because PlanetSide 2 didn't have level-based servers, so you were, as a level 1, you were joining in with level 100 pluses who all had much better gear and could just decimate you, and the game was not fun. Different story.
I guess you could have a weird case where you have a game that's meant for co-op or something, and the game won't start unless both players are connected at the same time. As long as it's possible to run it for those 2 players or however many, then yeah, it still works. So I don't see any reason they would really have to change. Wouldn't more clear labeling fix the problem? Well, the problem is games being destroyed. So I kind of don't care how clearly the game is telling me it's going to destroy a game I paid for. I don't like that being on the table to begin with. Now, the exception is a hard date when the game stops working. Like subscription games. You stop paying after 30 days, that game ends for you. So I think if people saw on the box or the store page that this game expires on January 1st, 2026, I think that would wake people up and change their buying habits.
So, I mean, are we saying that would be okay? I mean, that goes back to what I said earlier. Is it okay if they announce an end of date then, and it's over? I don't really...
But I
Maybe he's
also
not
think
making that point,
anything
but I
less
don't know.
than that would not. This becomes a very psychological thing then, and it's a way riskier route to saving games than what we're doing. How will this be enforced? I don't know. Ask the European Union. I mean, how does it work now if a business does something like false advertising?
Yeah, I mean, here's the reality is that it's not Ross's responsibility to make the legislature. I do think that it would be nice if we had a much more accurate FAQ on the official site. I say we, but I just kind of mean, like, I support the initiative. I unfortunately can't sign it because I'm not an EU citizen, but I still support it. And I would like to have more accurate information, especially for developers, because that's what I am mainly focused on, is what this is going to do to development. But I'm also a gamer, and I want to make sure that if we have this, that I don't have to end up now paying more for games. I live in Poland. I pay $60 for games just like everybody else in the Western world. But guess what? Our salaries over here in Poland are 3 to 4 times less than the rest of the world. Rest of the West world, let's say. Games are expensive for us here. It's fucking expensive. I can take a $60 game, or I can eat for oftentimes a whole month. That's how much $60 can get me here in Poland. So I don't want that to cost more. I don't want that to cost $70, $80. Should be okay, I think, if everyone involved agrees. And I just don't know. I think that we shouldn't be making excuses for the wording being vague when we could find people to contribute to the Stop Killing Games initiative who are developers and who might be able to provide better responses for the FAQ to kind of put to rest some of these worries that developers would have. A month, you're going a bit overboard. Yeah, I mean, I do buy some stuff that's a little expensive sometimes. Yummy cheese.
They get fined, maybe a percentage of their earnings. I don't know. That's not our job. I do hope the penalty will be big enough to be a deterrent, however. Why don't you just petition companies doing this instead of making a new law? No offense, but how naive are you? I mean, I guess that might work 1% of the time. I mean, the companies open to that idea tend to do it on their own. I mean, right now we're facing hundreds of games at risk. So what makes more sense? To petition every single company behind those games, or to do it once to the government?
Assuming we can do it once. Assuming that one law could, with all of its clauses, cover all of the cases without negatively affecting what I worry about the most, which is small developers, because large publishers can afford to do this, right? They can afford to do it. They can afford to provide this end of life support. I don't think small developers always can.
What versions of the game will the dev have to release? This is another one that's hazy. I personally would argue any. It just gets so muddy otherwise. For most games, the latest version tends to be the best one, but not always, and a few games tend to have big differences in content between versions, so I can understand people wanting to go back, but man, that might be a bridge too far to ask on this.
Well,
I guess
there are also some cases where developers don't actually have that. You know, most developers do use versioning software, but there are some older builds that may not be able to be compiled anymore. They might have issues compiling it, or what have you, right? Different requirements by the operating system. So now he's right. It isn't really possible. It isn't really tenable. I would simply not make server-based games. I think that will happen. For better or worse, whatever your thoughts are, just know passing this initiative will kill some games from being made that are considered live service. And if you're okay with that, again, that's just an acceptable or unacceptable thing that will happen because of this.
I guess I should have added this to the compromise list. Won't games get more expensive because of this? I'll keep it real. It's not impossible, but it's probably not why you think. Okay, for sake of argument, let's say it costs 1% of the total game cost. And let's also say a new $70 game just breaks even, so 1% of that cost. That will put it at $70.70. But what's to stop a company from saying, hey, we have to conform to end-of-life plans now, so why don't we really push the price to $75 or $80? Hell, let's try for $85.
Don't give them ideas.
Yes, some companies could do that.
Yeah, they will.
And this sort of thing has already happened outside of games. Like after the pandemic, we had a lot of inflation. Let's just say it was 10%. So instead of raising their prices 10%, companies looked at that and thought, why not raise them 50% or 100 or 200%? We can make a lot more money then, and we can blame it all on inflation. So there was real inflation and companies jacked up the price.
That's a good point. Like, they will probably increase prices and they will blame the initiative. And I think that while some of that would be true, he's right. They're probably going to jack it up more than it actually costs, because why not, right? If they can get away with blaming it on that successfully, they'll just continue to do it, and it will become the new norm.
But the thing is, you either have to own the market or do that collectively with
I don't know what the 1% was in response to. If that was of how much it would cost to prepare for the end of life, I promise you it's probably not 1% of the and that's 1% of the final cost of the game, but what you need to do is put the 1% on the budget of the game, not the cost of the game to the consumer. And maybe he's saying that, well, we could charge 1% extra for the game and it would cover the budget. That entirely depends on game. That entirely depends, because if it's 1% of the final consumer cost of the game, of the PPU, then that assumes that there will be enough people who buy it. So let's say if it's 70 cents, that you have 1 million customers, in which case that the end of life support would cost you $70,000. If my math isn't wrong on that, right? That jacking up a $70 game by 1% to gain 70% more from the consumer without any other fees or reductions would gain you an additional $70,000 from 1 million users. I promise you, $70,000 isn't enough to even pay for one good server developer for 1 year. 1% of 4 million is still $40K, which is more than I earn a year. Say it's X%, what is the argument worth if you're just throwing numbers? To me, it's you have to actually know what that is going to cost for developers, because that is going to give you the best outcome to understand what they're going to ask from consumers now. And most live service games do not getting 1 million customers on any game is exceptional. Getting that on a live service game, sure, it might be more reasonable than getting it, especially if it's a free-to-play game, than getting that on a single-player game. But if you're charging for a premium game $70, that's a big AAA Ubisoft EA title, right? And then you have live service portions on top of that make money. They're probably not going to put that into the price of the game, but put it into the live service, because depending on the life of the game, they're probably making more money total from sustaining the live service game than they did on original sales. Look at GTA Online as an example. They're making way more money off of the live service elements than they are off of the premium purchase of the title itself. But they're still making money off of it. So I don't think that saying 1% is reasonable, because it's going to cost way more than 1% to develop this, especially 1% if you put it on top of the PPU, because that's really not a good metric. Most developers do have goals of how many sales they want to make, because that's how they determine how much they need to charge each PPU in order to, price per unit for people who don't know, to make a return on investment if that's a premium game. Then they have additional metrics that they use to determine how much they're going to make from the monetization within the game and how much is going to be needed to sustain it year over year or month over month. So I don't think 1% is it's philosophical. And he didn't claim that it was factual. He said if it cost this much. But I'm just saying it's probably going to cost more than 1% to the user if we want to go that metric of how much would it add to the PPU. And that's if they add it to the PPU instead of the monetization methods. Sorry, that was a bit ranty. But just saying, I think that it's going to cost a lot more than that. And that will, like he says here, it will get passed on to consumers. And like I've said.
Because as soon as one big company breaks ranks, then they can kind of get away with more market share because they're selling their game cheaper.
Selling games cheaper does not guarantee selling more copies or retaining individuals. Does not guarantee that.
Honestly, not sure if there are price fixing laws on this sort of thing. Isn't Sony being sued over jacking up their prices? The thing to remember is they're going to try and find ways to increase prices.
Sued does not mean that they win a suit.
On you anyway. So is fear of a price increase, which they may or may not do, which may get them into trouble with regulatory boards anyway, worth the cost of destroying all online games?
It wouldn't be price fixing to increase the price if you had proof that it was costing more to develop. I don't think there's anything preventing a developer from making a game and selling it for $100. There's nothing. If that's what they think that their product is worth, they can sell it for that much. It's just what is industry standard, but what is standard and acceptable by the market is different than what is legally possible. Those are two very different things.
I'd say no. What if a game company goes bankrupt?
Yeah, this is a big question for me.
The most likely penalties would be financial, so if they're bankrupt, then it's kind of moot point. Yeah, the game would still die, but then the company would have more skin in the game. There wouldn't be a financial incentive to kill the game the way there is now. I would think most companies are very motivated not to go bankrupt. Hey, if every time a game had been destroyed in the past, the parent company had gone bankrupt over it, I wouldn't have even started this campaign. Won't big companies...
I'm not sure we should necessarily be dancing on the graves of developers losing their jobs. That's, me protecting my industry, the one time that I'll do it. And I'm not saying every company deserves to stay alive necessarily for the things they do, but there are a lot of good developers that don't deserve to lose their jobs simply because the parent company made shitty decisions or was run poorly. But, that is what it is. It's business, right? I was going to ask this. Won't big companies just make shell companies so they bankrupt the company every time they want to shut down a game? There could be ways around that, but that would be a loophole without legislation.
Just make shell companies so they bankrupt the company every time
they're still owned by the parent company, so the parent company would be financially responsible.
Down a game? Again, it's not impossible, but remember, companies like to make money. So is the cost of shuttering an entire studio and cooking the books to make them bankrupt and spinning up a new studio for the next game more than having an end-of-life plan?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Microsoft and the Embracer Group, and who else. You'd have to ask them whether or not it was financially successful to do what they did. And the unfortunate reality is they might say yes.
Plus, this would make having a good reputation kind of impossible. What about games that are so huge in scope they can't be hosted on home computers?
Yeah.
Well, I think this leads more credence to the best effort solution. I can think of two examples. One is EVE Online. I believe it can host up to 500,000 players simultaneously. Yeah, no customer system's going to be able to do that. But if they had to shut down, does that mean they can't release an end-of-life build where maybe 100 could connect?
It depends, because the 500, whatever it is, 500,000, whoever, of course some of that is going to be on... Again, I don't know how EVE hosts their servers. It could be that it requires multiple servers in order to handle that, but it could also handle different chunks of the world. So trying to get that to run on a single computer, that still might be an issue, even if you only allow 1 or 2 players. But of course, at that point, is it still EVE Online if only 4 players can connect? That's up to the individual to decide. But I don't think that scaling users is exactly going to end up with less processing power, or at least enough processing power gained back to host it on a single computer. There could be other things that they do that's to split up the game and to, transfer between different shards being run on different servers within the same server farm. I don't know how EVE handles it, but I know that there are games that probably handle it like that. Maybe EVE, maybe Star Citizen, maybe other things that are on similar level. Not saying it can't be done, but scaling back number of users may not be a perfect fix all the time.
Or maybe they just release the server code, let the community figure out, and they decide how many custom resources they want to throw at this for how many players. Another case I'm thinking of is Microsoft Flight Simulator, where in order for that game to look its best, it has to connect to Bing Maps, which has 2 petabytes of data it's accessing.
That's a good example. I forgot that Microsoft Flight Sim did that. I totally forgot that's why I needed an online connection, is to handle that.
So if that game had to shut down, I think it would be reasonable for them to say, okay, here's all the data. We'll keep it hosted for 90 days or so. Good luck trying to download it. You're on your own now. As long as it's possible in some capacity. That's the main point.
But then you have to define what's possible. If I just release a broken ass build, sure. Well, it's possible to fix it, because if we had made more money as a company, we could have fixed it. It's possible to fix any online game given enough time and money. But the reason why most games die and servers go offline is because it didn't remain financially possible to do so. So I don't know if we can ever define what possible means in this case, but if it isn't clear, it will be abused.
The players can deal with all the rough edges. Don't some games deserve to die? Actually, yes.
I
But one
disagree.
man's trash is another man's treasure. So that's a subjective assessment.
Yes.
If you've paid money into the game, then you should have a voice on whether you get to keep it or not. If all online games were awful, then yeah, this initiative wouldn't be necessary. But that's not reality. How does Ubisoft and the crew relate to this initiative? That's completely separate from this initiative. That was about reporting to consumer protection agencies, and that's largely underway. So those are two different things. You don't have to be connected to the crew for any of this. What are the chances of this initiative passing? That's a hard question to answer.
I don't know if anyone can
for
answer
getting
that.
the signatures, you tell me. I don't know. I would bet if we do get the signatures, this solves problems. But that's almost not the way to even look at it. It's like I said at the beginning, the initiative and Stop Killing Games is it for action on this issue. If we fail at this, we fail for life. The industry's only going to get worse permanently on this issue. I feel like the Dutch boy with my finger in the dam here.
I'm not so pessimistic. I'm not saying for sure it will get better, but I think there's enough change happening within AAA that their players are making their voices heard, and it may not be quick, it may not be next year, it may not be 5 years from now, hell, it may not be 10 years from now. But I do think that when players don't like something enough, they can make their voices heard loud enough that things do change. This feels like he's going too far in the wrong direction. I think he has the best of intentions, but didn't do enough research to put himself. But I don't think he has to. Like, I could agree, but it's not his responsibility to make that. I think he's already done it enough, if you ask me. I just think that as a collective, if there are, I don't even know how many people have signed this initiative yet. Let me see if I can find it. 245,000 people. Within this number, I'm very positive that there are enough individuals to, try to solve some of these problems. Try to find ways to close the loopholes, to help to even write laws to the best of our non-lawyer abilities, to at least have something better to stand on than what we had before. And that's what I want to do. I'm very skeptical. Sure, I'm very critical. And I think that in a lot of cases, I don't see this being possible. But that doesn't mean that I'm right about it. And I'd rather just talk with other developers or with Ross himself. Hopefully, we can set that up here soon. And just see if there's a way to solve some of these problems. Or if maybe we're just both like, I don't know. We need to bring more, experts into this and more lawyers and people who know what they're talking about. Makes this initiative so groundbreaking. I don't know. Not my words.
If this goes, that's it. There's no round two. It's over.
I don't blame you, Lazarla, for the first impression solely in the proposal. Or I don't, or vice versa, if I said it wrong. I don't blame you. I kind of feel the same way. But I'm at least giving it, I will at least continue to give it my thought if it continues to be, refined, right? People with bad ideas, or let's just say good ideas, but I'm just kind of, I was going to say like game design, right? If somebody comes to me with a bad idea for a game, that doesn't mean that we can't turn it into something good. It just means we've had a bit of a shaky start of where we were trying to go with it, and we can refine it and work on it from there. So as long as Ross is willing to continue to be open to discussing this, and I think he is, I haven't seen anything to say that he isn't, then we'll just keep talking about it and keep pushing it forward and see if we can find the best way to make this initiative as possible.
Okay, that's it for questions. I have a few quick corrections. First, I made a mistake on this video with counting, where I said your votes don't count unless they pass the threshold. No, they do, so don't worry about that. Just get more votes. The second is, for some countries, you can use EID. The way it was explained to me is if you already have one of these, you don't need our guides. So we left it out just to keep it simple. But you can use it. Okay, well, there are probably literally endless questions, but I hope I answered enough to clear up where we stand on this. I have put some thought into this topic. This video hopefully got rid of some fence sitters. Which side they landed on, I have no idea. For those on board, go sign it. All right, that's it. See ya.
Yeah, I think that did help to clear up some things, although we still are, we're still in the murky depths of figuring out how we can close up loopholes and prevent publishers from taking advantage of consumers, and how we can prevent this from negatively impacting smaller developers that assumedly don't want to be this anti-consumer or unethical, although they still can be. I think it was crazy for real to turn me off from the project. I'd have to see more informed approach before getting on board. Yeah, and I think that just takes time and discussion. And if I don't know if Pyro Software is still willing to do that, I kind of hope that he does reach out, because he has a lot more information and influence than I do. But I'll do whatever I can to reach out to Ross and just talk to him, and maybe if I can help clear up one big question or even one small question, I'll feel like I've done a positive thing for this initiative, and we can move it forward from there and pass it off to people with more expertise. So no, I think that was a good video, and I'm willing to continue to see where it goes from here, and I hope that other people with more specific knowledge about servers and game development in areas that I have not worked in personally can join in and provide a different perspective. So yeah, either way, thank you for people watching on YouTube for that. I'm sure you'll cook me in the comments like usual. I look forward to it, because every opinion matters in this case, and we don't know what to do until somebody mentions it. So thank you for watching on YouTube, and catch you later.